Today, we're announcing our new project, Waypoint. Waypoint is a new free and open source project available now. Waypoint gives you a consistent workflow to build, deploy, and release your applications on any platform. The way Waypoint works, based on what we learned with other tools, is Waypoint Up. The Waypoint Up command encapsulates the build, deploy, and release phases all in one command to focus on getting your application from development into production. You could see here on this slide that we break down each phase, the build, deploy, and release, into the specific tool that you want to use to make that happen, the platform where you want it to go to, and the logic you want to use to release it to the public. We take each of these configurations and we put it into a single Waypoint configuration file. So seeing this example here, we would put in the build phase, the deploy phase, and the release phase. By putting it all in one file, you could reference this one file to know the full logic and life cycle of how that application gets to production. You could see here that Waypoint isn't trying to replace tools like Helm or Docker or Kubernetes directly. What we're trying to do here is wrap these tools and actually glue them together in the right order and provide a consistent workflow on top of them. So for the build, we're using cloud native build packs here. That's what the pack means in this example file. For deployment, we're using Kubernetes, and for that, we will be creating deployments, services, etc. And for release management, we're also just using Kubernetes native systems, and in this case, we use the Kubernetes service primitives to point to the correct deployment that we want the public to see. And so you could see that we're able to compose these different technologies and give a consistent workflow on top of it. When you run a Waypoint up, the output looks something like this. You'll see the build, you'll see the output as part of that, you'll see the deploy happening, and then you'll get a release at the end. With the release, you'll get a release URL. The release URL is the public URL that people can visit to see this application. This is provided by the platform. So in the case of Kubernetes here, we're getting an IP address for a load balancer. And below that, you get a deployment URL. And you'll notice that this deployment URL has a waypoint.run domain. This uses a service that we run that is separate from Waypoint in order to provide routable URLs for all your deployments. This is an optional service, but it's really nice because it gives you a URL to every application that you have, no matter what platform it's on, and it's consistent. And Waypoint Up works across any application code to any platform. So it doesn't matter what programming language you're using or where you're deploying it to, Waypoint Up gives you that same consistent workflow, URL output, deployment URLs across any mix of these platforms and programming languages. So you run Waypoint Up. The next question is always, is it running? Any deployment tool you use, you do the deploy, and the next thing you check is if it's actually running. This might just be opening up a URL, refreshing a few times, it might be checking logs. Either way, you just want to make sure the deploy actually worked. And so we think it's important for a tool that does a deploy to also give you those tools necessary to validate that your deployment actually worked. And so with Waypoint, we provide a number of features to validate that the deployment worked. One way to validate your deployments is through our UI. Waypoint has a UI that you could visit in the web browser that shows you a list of all your builds, deploys, releases, and their current status. You could use this to verify that your deployment is actually complete. And you know that we built this for developers because we also have a dark mode. Another tool you could use that we provide is Waypoint Exec. Waypoint Exec is a tool on the command line that you could use to open a shell or execute any process in the context of a deployment. So you could do this to read a file, check logs, debug things. This gives you access to any deployment to make sure that it's up and running. And Waypoint Exec works across any platform you're deploying to. So we know tools like Kubernetes provide a similar exec style functionality on its own, but you can also use Waypoint Exec with Google Cloud Run, EC2 instances, and anything else that Waypoint supports. And it's the same experience across all of those. And so this gives you a great tool to make sure that your deployments are actually working. And another thing you could do is view logs. With Waypoint, you could run Waypoint logs, and as part of that, you could see all of the recent logs from all of your deployments of that application. And again, this works across every platform consistently. So even if one of your platforms provides a log-like capability, you could also get this for every other one that you're using a consistent workflow. And these logs, they aren't meant to replace long-term log storage or log searching. These are really just recent, past few days, past few weeks set of logs that you could use to just quickly diagnose any challenges you might be seeing, or just to verify that everything is up and running as you would expect. And those are a few sets of tools that give you the ability to validate that your deployments are actually working, and also to debug issues that might happen later on. The last pillar that's very important for Waypoint is extensibility. We want to make sure that Waypoint can work the way you want to work, as well as work where you want to work. So it's extensible via a plugin interface, and the workflow is flexible to work in a variety of scenarios. Let's take a look at the workflow first. A common way people like to deploy applications is CI/CD. There's other things that you're trying to do as part of deployment that doesn't necessarily fit into a standard build, deploy, release cycle. And so CI/CD is a great way to wrap that up. Waypoint works great with CI/CD. We've provided a number of examples and documentation of how you could run Waypoint directly within your CI/CD platforms. And in doing so, you really simplify that step that's actually deploying your application to be consistent across a variety of different places. Another way people like to work is through a GitOps or Git-based workflow. And usually the way this looks is you would do a Git push, and as part of the Git push, it also triggers a deploy either to production or just a preview. And so with Waypoint, we've both documented and published plugins for different version control systems so that you could integrate this directly into your Git workflows. And so in this screenshot, we show you our GitHub integration. With the GitHub integration, we've made it so that every branch will get a separate build, deploy, release, and a deployment URL that is branch specific. So you could actually see for your branch the preview of that deploy, how it's working, and then when you merge it into your main branch, it'll deploy into production. All of this is super configurable and just an example of what's possible with Waypoint. And there's a variety of other ways people like to work. So we mentioned CI/CD, we mentioned Git. Some people like to trigger deploys via Slack. Some people just like to use a UI. And of course, there's a lot of people that use the terminal, the command line interface, and are comfortable with that. And as you could see through the couple examples we gave, Waypoint is flexible to work in all of these environments. And it's not just flexible to work in those environments, it works across them as well. You could deploy something by clicking in the UI at the same time as someone deploying something using the CLI at the same time that someone is maybe pushing a branch into GitHub and getting a branch-based deployment. Waypoint lets you work the way you want to work, or the way that your company or organization wants to work. The next thing is making sure that Waypoint supports all the available systems that you want to orchestrate with it, that it could deploy to the platform you want to, that it builds images the way that you want to build them. And to do that, Waypoint has a fully pluggable, extensible interface. This is a feature of software that you've come to know and love from HashiCorp. We do this with almost everything we build, and Waypoint is no exception. With Waypoint, you could build plugins that are custom builders, custom registries of where these artifacts could be sent to. You could build custom platforms of where the deployments are sent, or where the deployments run. And then finally, you could also build plugins to do custom release management. Do you want to do blue-green deployments? Do you want to just deploy right away? You could customize all of this through a plugin interface. And we support almost more than a dozen plugins out of the box, but we expect this to grow significantly as the community jumps in and starts building more plugins. So with Waypoint, I highlighted the 3 important pillars that we've built it on. We want to make sure that Waypoint provides a consistency in its workflow. We also want to make sure that as part of that workflow, you have confidence that it worked. We showed that through exec logs, etc. And then finally, we want it to be extensible and to build an ecosystem. And that's done via our plugin interface and really the flexibility of Waypoint to support all of these different environments. So we saw build, deploy, release, exec logs, etc. But there's so many more plugins I wasn't able to show you, and other features just listed here today. There's also a lot more that we want to build towards. This is an initial release after all. So we're really excited about where Waypoint is going to go. So today, Waypoint 0.1 is now available. You could find Waypoint at waypointproject.io. Give it a try. We really hope you love it.